Welcome to Babblecom 5. This is episode 2 of season 5 of Babylon 5, The Very Long Night of Londo Mollari. Delenn leaves her 45-degree inclined bed as Sheridan turns over in order to answer a call. It seems that she has put in a request for a new aide, only she hasn't. It seems Lanier is leaving, potentially permanently, but had not informed her. Elsewhere, Londo is negotiating in typically delicate fashion for the release of a very old and expensive bottle of Brevari from Zack's customs embargo. Veer tries to step in and take Zack to one side as Londo decides to test the merchandise. Unfortunately, just after he's taken a sip, the bottle crashes to the floor, shortly followed by its owner as Zack calls in a med team. Londo is rushed into medlab with Veer at his side, the working assumption being that he's been poisoned by the Brevari. Franklin orders some initial tests, and security are testing the bottle. In Delenn's quarters, she waits to see if Lanier will volunteer his news, then presses the point when he doesn't. What follows is a difficult conversation as neither Lanier nor Delenn quite say what they want to say. Lanier basically finds himself a third wheel now, and is uncomfortable with the situation, and to Delenn's surprise and upset, he announces his intention to join the Anla Shock, which he claims is in part to fill the gap left with Marcus, but is also to try and earn more respect from her. She says that he has always had that, and that he swore herself to her side. He says that has not changed, that he will return in between training cycles, but says this is the calling of his heart, which she of all people should appreciate. Garibaldi finds Veer to tell him the original assumption was off. It was in fact a heart attack that had struck Londo down rather than an assassination attempt. This quietens Veer, and he asks which heart, to which the response is his left, which Veer takes badly. Sheridan and Franklin discuss his condition, which makes it clear that the left heart in a Centauri is a secondary heart but provides a kidney-like functionality, as a result of which it is rich with tiny veins, which makes it very difficult to repair without causing additional damage. An artificial heart system will be dispatched from Centauri Prime, but will take 3 days to arrive. Londo has perhaps one on life support unless something changes. Delenn is joined by Sheridan as she watches over the uncommonly quiet Londo. They both note that whilst he has frequently caused difficulties, it is difficult to see him like this, and he would be missed if he were to pass. Sheridan raises the issue with Lanier to see if there's anything he can do, and asking if it's because of him. When Delenn says yes, in part, he says 3's a crowd, to which Delenn replies on Minbar 3 is sacred. But no, she doesn't think there's anything to be done on that front. As for Londo, Franklin has done what he can, but ultimately Sheridan thinks that the patient has a lot to do with survival in this sort of situation. If he makes it through the night, he has a chance. Delenn wishes him good luck. And in his mind's eye, he has half heard her, and searches for her through the corridors of Babylon 5 with no one reacting to him. When he finds Delenn, she is veiled, holding tarot cards of his past. She collects them, and they bleed. She asks him repeatedly if he wants to live, he noting that there is no one who would care one way or another, to which she agrees. Finally, he does say yes, but as a very human-looking Delenn replaces her veil, she says that is not enough in isolation. Another word is needed. He asks what the place is, and she points to a glowing red grating that he lifts to reveal what looks like the surface of a heart beating. Then the scene shifts to complete darkness, in which only he stands, then Jakar. Veer is at the bar when Lanier joins him, presumably in a continuation of their ritual of meeting each other once a week to complain about their respective positions. This time is no different, except that it does include a parting of their ways, and an amusing misinterpretation of the cultural significance of a Shirley temple. They exchange the Minbari steepling of fingers greeting, then hug, with Lanier due to leave early in the morning. As Veer moves to a travel tube, the scene's angle lurches and Londo emerges into the now deserted corridor, complete with a touch of Steadicam. He finally settles down to try and have a drink with Sheridan in his Earth Force uniform, as they note they have both been dead before. Londo interestingly notes that he always thought Sheridan would be there when he died. Londo notes that he died when he divorced his first wife, a dancer, owing to family pressure. Londo notes Sheridan only has 20 years left, but Sheridan counters that it's not the time you have, it's what you do with it that matters. Londo says he hasn't done well on that front, to which Sheridan agrees, with Londo noting people aren't terribly sympathetic to him in here. As they speak, Sheridan goes to Army of Light uniform to Ranger 1, to a White Shroud, to a Ball of Light, the latter just before he tells Londo to turn around to face Jakar, who is standing at the top of the flight of stairs onto the Zocalo. He says he can't. In reality, his blood pressure drops as Franklin orders the equivalent of an adrenaline shot into his heart to try and stabilize him. In his mind's eye, Londo clutches his chest. Franklin rejects a suggestion that he get some rest, as Veer arrives and questions whether it's a death watch. Franklin tells him honestly it could be. Veer encourages Londo not to die in real life and his dream state, but in the dream state is more forceful, telling him that if he dies here and now, the prophecy he has had of his death becomes no more than metaphor. His heart can no longer carry the burden of his conscience, so he must turn around now. Londo thinks perhaps it would be for the best if he did go, but Veer says he would miss him. Londo says he would miss him too, and turns to face Jakar just as Jakar enters Medlab. And so the scene shifts to the royal court as Jakar recounts the bombing of the Narn homeworld with indiscriminate mass drivers and his lashing nearly to death for Cartage's pleasure. And the common factor in both of these? Mollari said nothing, did nothing, simply witnessed. He claims innocence, claims it would have made no difference. But Jakar says he had an obligation to speak out, whether or not it would have made a difference. And as his condition worsens, as he refuses to acknowledge this failing, the scene switches and now Jakar is Cartagia, Londo is Jakar, and it is Londo who takes the lashes as he simultaneously watches on. In the real world, Franklin is defibrillating him to try and keep him going as the lash count rises. At 39 he screams just as Jakar did, and then it's just them. Jakar notes he could be his guilty conscience, he could be a part of himself left embedded in Londo when he entered his mind under the influence of dust. Whatever is the case, Londo notes that he has never apologised for anything, and Jakar notes it's his life. The pulsating red patch returns, and Londo finally screams he's sorry, smashing the glass over the heart. The medics report he's stabilised and his left heart is functioning. In real life he apologises to Jakar out loud. Jakar is clearly taken aback but says nothing and leaves. Veer is equally stunned. As Londo complains about the Medlab food, Veer says he's going to need to change his diet and cut down on stress, the latter making Londo laugh as his future is very unlikely to be stress-free. He asks Veer about an old Centauri folk tale where a spirit tries to leave a body so another can come in that is more worthy. Veer had heard of it since being young, but apparently Londo hadn't, suggesting that whatever went on in his mind wasn't predicated on something he already knew of. Lanier is waiting alone for some of the analyst shock to arrive to escort him off station, and Delenn arrives just before he departs, as he says he would never say goodbye to her. Again, more goes unsaid than said as he leaves. Sheridan misses him entirely, and Delenn seems torn as he heads off with her. I recalled parts of this episode well, others not so much, and it is a slightly curious one. Strangely, for the time taken on each segment, the Lanier and Delenn element is probably the stronger of the two, because we know Lanier has strong feelings for Delenn and she respects him, but she is clearly committed to another. Sheridan seems rather like an afterthought in this episode, and his interaction with Delenn seems a little off somehow. I can't quite put my finger on it. Maybe he just doesn't grasp the bond between the pair. After all, he wasn't the one looking after Delenn in her chrysalis. Lanier actually has more history with her than him. Now, the whole glowy red beating heart metaphor in the dream sequence was rather B-movie-esque, I felt. It was somehow out of place for Babylon 5, even in a dream sequence. Speaking of which, the show has had a tendency to show past events in black and white, but they didn't go with that this time for the clips with Reefer and Cartagia. In fact, they were quite long segments for them to reuse. The element with Delenn was interesting because it didn't really look, perhaps for the first time ever, like Minbari Delenn at all. More like a Centauri version, yet with too much hair for that. So, not really sure what was being aimed at there with that representation of her. Long-time viewers would, I'm sure, draw parallels with telepathic intrusions and Kosh's tendency to enter minds when there is a low ebb. But of course, neither of these is the case here, although Jakar does allude to his presence being a side effect of his own telepathic intrusion into Londo's mind in the past. The reality, though, is more likely that it is purely intended to be Londo's subconscious trying to have a reckoning with itself. On that basis, I'd say Sheridan's progression through different uniforms is interesting because at one point he almost looks like he's wearing a Centauri telepath robe. Then he seems to ascend, for want of a better word. I can't recall if Londo has even seen the Ranger 1 robes, so you do wonder whether Sheridan is actually there, owing to his contact with Kosh and Lorien. It's a possibility. Very interesting that Londo mentions having a sense of Sheridan being there at his death. That's the first time we've ever heard that from him, and it does feel almost retconny in the light of War Without End. Again, you'd have to have been a hardcore follower of the show to notice that, of course. Did the lashing of Londo sequence work? It was an odd switch about, and Jakar seemed a bit over the top with it, as did the sheer amount of defibrillation going on. I think that whole sequence could have been shortened down. We'd already seen the original in quite extended detail. Yet I think we do all appreciate the aim of this story. That Londo might not have initiated the worst excesses during the war, but he actively chose not to challenge them. Although I believe he did actually challenge the use of mass drivers, if not the attack itself. The other aspect of this is, yes, it's obviously very significant that Londo does apologise to Jakar in real life, but he does so only after a near-death experience, and a long time after the events they've been through. Jakar doesn't acknowledge it, and you have to wonder whether it means as much or anything to him as it may do to us. Perhaps one to be looked at in more depth later in the season. Ultimately, we are left with the prophecy we've had since the beginning of the show still intact, although a suggestion from Virda in the dream sequence that even that is not necessarily written in stone. I'm also not entirely sure how come his left heart fixes itself quite so fully, it seems, because Franklin Clee didn't rate his odds, and then all of a sudden the medics seem perfectly happy with how he is. So maybe a blockage cleared itself, owing to the amount of defibrillation and so on going on. I don't know, but it feels like it wasn't quite resolved in a sort of a hard science fiction way, if that makes sense. So this once again feels like quite a retro twin plotline sort of episode from back in the early days, but it was nice to see Lanier and Veer acknowledge their relationship in typically quasi-awkward fashion given how far apart their cultures are. Always entertaining. We will now presumably see a little less of Lanier on the station, and it did occur to me as he was leaving that he's already pretty proficient with the White Star, given how much he flew with White Star 1, so perhaps that will allow for a more accelerated progress in his Analyst Shock training. There is still that question over his motivation for joining the Analyst Shock, and what he hopes he will achieve. That seems likely to be something we'll explore further. As summer holiday season approaches, I'm going to try and get ahead of myself, so from my point of view, I shall be back with you pretty shortly, although I'll stick to my weekly schedule. Cheers for now.